$3.9 billion worth of Canadian nickel flows into Detroit every year, quietly powering America's electric dreams. But then came August. And with one signature, the man in the White House who once sold steaks in casinos decided he knew best how to run a supply chain. Trump's 20% EV tariff didn't just hit China. It struck Canada, our oldest trading partner, our neighbor, our we watch hockey together friend. No exemption, no negotiation, just a tax wall tall enough to block common sense. And now, Ottawa's not tweeting threats, they're drafting trade weapons. Because when you choke the lifeline of North America's battery belt, don't be surprised if Canada reaches for the defibrillator or the detonator. Of course. Let's pick up where we left off after Mr. Wall Builder-in-Chief decided that saving American jobs apparently meant taxing the very metal that powers American cars. For decades, the nickel vein from Sudbury, Ontario to Detroit has been the quiet backbone of America's electric vehicle dream. Not China. Not Russia. Ontario. Every year, 185,000 tons of nickel-copper ore flow down this corridor, pumping out more than $3.9 billion in cathode material for U.S. battery plants. That's not a trade deficit, that's a lifeline. But try telling that to the man currently playing Monopoly with tariffs. Here's where it gets dumber. Each 86 kilowatt-hour battery pack in a typical SUV using good old NMC 811 chemistry relies on about 38 kilograms of nickel, making up 80% of every cell. At current market rates $20,400 per ton, that's $775 just in nickel for one pack. And now, thanks to the 30% tariff, we get to add another $230 to that cost just for crossing the border. That brings the total increase to about $950 to $1,020 per battery, which slashes GM's projected margin from 10.1% to 8.3%. And let me tell you, corporate America doesn't like single digits unless it's in tax brackets. Worse, this brilliant strategy is forecast to wipe out 94,000 EV sales in 2026 alone, according to IRENA's July simulation. So let's do the math. We've got a pro-America tax that raises prices, cuts profits, and makes American EVs less competitive while forcing GM to squeeze consumers and lay off engineers. It's like putting a brick on the gas pedal and then blaming the brakes for failing. The battery belt wasn't broken, but someone in the Oval Office thought it needed fixing with a sledgehammer. Picking up where we left off after Detroit's battery plants took a beating from a tariff drafted by someone who once claimed windmills cause cancer. We head north, where Ottawa wasn't just watching, it was loading ammunition. By the end of July, Canada didn't hold a press conference. They held a playbook. 4 moves. Clean, sharp, and designed not to shout but to squeeze. First, a 15% export tax on raw nickel, targeting U.S. cathode makers who've been importing Sudbury metal duty-free for years. So much for special relationship, huh? Second, a carbon tracking mechanism for exported cathode materials. Translation: only Ontario's low-emission nickel produced with hydro and electrolysis gets access to the NAFTA fast lane. Anything dirtier? Take the long road or find another buyer. Because if the White House wants America first, Canada's fine with best price, cleanest carbon. Third, a $257 million Canadian dollar investment fund along the Quebec-Ontario corridor, accelerating LFP battery development. That means fewer grams of nickel needed per cell and less dependence on any country that confuses tariffs with strategy. And finally, Ottawa's crown jewel, special tax incentives to anchor Stellantis LG's 20 gigawatt-hour cell plant in Windsor. You want jobs? So does Canada. And they're playing to win. According to the Canadian Expenditure Office's July 28 memo, these combined measures could redirect over $1.8 billion in export value from U.S. buyers to South Korea and the EU by 2027. As for Carney, he didn't tweet, he didn't rant. But behind closed doors, the message was surgical. Nickel and cobalt are our diamonds. We will not hesitate to play our tax card. And suddenly, the room at the White House got very quiet, because it turns out when you choke a lifeline, it might just fight back with interest. Let's be clear, Ottawa didn't just slap back. They adjusted course, recalibrated trade routes, and quietly began sending their nickel elsewhere. And the numbers aren't subtle. In the first half of 2025, Canada's nickel sulfate exports jumped 23%. But here's the twist. US market share fell, while South Korea and Germany stepped in with open arms. While Washington was busy building tariff walls like it was 1930, our allies were busy signing new delivery schedules. The cleanest nickel in the hemisphere, once headed straight to Michigan, is now being packed for Hamburg and Seoul. And what does that leave the American EV industry with? A future dependent on laterite nickel from Indonesia and the Philippines, the fast food of minerals. Cheap, dirty, and full of environmental regrets. Let's talk emissions. Ontario's refined nickel averages just 4.2 tons of CO2 per ton of metal, thanks to hydro and electrolysis. Meanwhile, nickel from Indonesia comes with a carbon tag of about 36 tons of CO2 per ton. That's nearly 9 times higher. Nickel from China? Still heavy, about 18 tons for every ton of metal refined. So here's the kicker. In 2026, the EU will begin enforcing a carbon border tax of 115 euros per ton of CO2. That means any EV made in the US with dirty nickel could get slapped with a massive environmental surcharge just to enter European markets. The policy from the Oval Office was sold as economic protectionism. But it's shaping up to be a diplomatic boomerang, and a green one at that. Because when you chase away your cleanest supplier, guess what you're left holding? A truckload of taxes and a vehicle that can't cross borders without a climate confession. Meanwhile, somewhere between a closed-door meeting and a campaign fundraiser, Washington is staring at 3 choices and none of them come with a golden elevator. Option 1. Carve out a special exemption for Canadian nickel. The 30% tariff stays for everyone else, but Sudbury gets a fast pass. That would keep the Ontario-Detroit battery lifeline intact and keep EV plants from hemorrhaging dollars. Option 2. Play hardball. No exemptions, full tariffs, no turning back. In return, Canada pulls the trigger. 15% export tax, limits supply, reroutes contracts to Europe and South Korea. Detroit gets left with spreadsheets full of panic and not much nickel. Option 3. Find a middle lane. Drop the tariff to 20 to 25%, patch up the US-Canada Critical Minerals Alliance, and pray the EU holds off on a carbon slapback. It's not perfect, but it's less self-sabotage. And how's the market betting? As of July 31st, analysts give a 60% chance to option 1 or 3, and a 40% shot that things go off the rails. GM isn't waiting. They've already cut their 2026 EV production forecast from 360,000 to 310,000 units, a $3.2 billion shift no one's laughing about. But hey, maybe that's what the 47th president calls negotiating. For the rest of us, it looks a lot like forcing your neighbor to take the bus, then wondering why your driveway's empty. And while trade reps shuffle policy papers in air-conditioned boardrooms, regular Americans are staring at showroom price tags and quietly backing away. Thanks to the 35% tariff and rising nickel costs, the price of the F-150 Lightning is now projected to hit $72,500 by early 2026. That's not just high, that's you might as well buy a boat high. Meanwhile, the good old gas-powered F-150 XLT, the working man's truck, still holds a 15 to 20% advantage over 8 years of total ownership cost. Translation: the electric truck got taxed into a luxury badge, and the fossil fuel version just became the value option. Remember, these tariffs were supposed to protect American workers. But the only thing getting protected right now is the profit margin on gasoline. Consumers. The same voters promised cheaper, cleaner cars are now being priced out of the EV market entirely. This isn't policy. This is shooting your own supply chain in the foot, then handing the bullet to your biggest competitor. While Biden's team aims for 50% of new car sales to be EVs by 2030, the current reality looks more like 20% hope, 80% sticker shock. And the man in the West Wing? He's too busy waging tariff wars to notice that America's middle class just got pushed out of the green future they were promised. So, who are EVs really for now? The answer sure isn't parked in your neighbor's driveway, unless your neighbor happens to run a hedge fund. And here's the punchline. No one at the White House seems to get. Ontario isn't begging for exemptions. It's printing boarding passes for its nickel shipments. If Sudbury can't send nickel south, it'll send it east. The European Union is starving for clean mineral supply, and Canada's low-carbon nickel fits their Green Deal like a glove. Meanwhile, South Korea has quietly boosted imports from Ontario by nearly 18% since March, according to Canada Trade Monitor's July 2025 report. So while Washington builds tariff walls, Ontario builds trade bridges. And in this new mineral chessboard, they're not the pawn. They're the one controlling the middle of the board. Nickel, once just a boring metal buried under rock, has become a geopolitical bargaining chip. A card. And right now, Ottawa's holding it with 2 fingers on the trigger. What we're witnessing isn't Canada losing leverage, it's Canada realizing it never needed American approval in the first place. Meanwhile, the guy in the West Wing is still staring at the tariff chart like it's a campaign ad. Spoiler alert, the real game isn't being played in Washington. It's being played in Sudbury. And Ontario? Ontario isn't losing, it's moving on. And so here we are 1 tariff later, and the nickel that once quietly powered America's electric future has turned into a diplomatic landmine. What used to be a handshake with our closest ally has become a negotiation under threat. A $3.9 billion trade artery, once pulsing between Ontario and Detroit, now faces a wall built not out of bricks but out of bad math and worse politics. Nickel, once just a line on a chemical chart, now holds the keys to who builds what, where, and for how much. And if the United States loses its grip on Ontario's clean supply, who's going to bet billions on an EV plant in Michigan? Because tariffs don't just raise prices, they raise red flags for investors. Meanwhile, Canada moves on, Europe opens its ports, and South Korea signs contracts. And in Washington, the man in the West Wing is too busy calling it a win to notice that America's battery belt is bleeding supply. So here's the real question. If the US keeps shutting the door on its allies, how long before those allies stop knocking? Or maybe they already have. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more sharp, in-depth breakdowns of global economic and political moves.